Okay guys, welcome to our roast profile series here at Pillar. This is being done in conjunction with Bush and Bush Coffee Systems. For those of you that don't know, Bush and Bush is also a business with myself and my brother Jake. And what we're trying to do with this business is to build a calibration system for the coffee industry from green bean to cup. That calibration system is focused around a product that we've made called the density press. Now the density press is this hardware here, and the density press also is backed by some software. So it takes a whole lot of different measurements and then across green bean, roasted bean, bird geometry and espresso, as well as brewing, and then takes all of those different measurements, puts them into a calculator and then spits out numbers that we can use to help us roast or extract. So earlier on in the year, we did a talk at MICE in May at Criteria Coffee, and we talked about a lot of things, specifically regards to roasting. So you can see here, these are about the topics that we discussed. Now, what we learned from this talk is that whilst people did grasp what we were talking about, we needed to flesh these concepts out a little bit more because some of them are, whilst easy to understand, are new concepts to roasters. So what we decided to do after that was to write a book specifically on density in roasting. And within that book, we need to look at heat transfer because obviously that's what roasting is all about. So heat transfer, in this case, we used 4 different roast curves, and those 4 roast curves we dissect and put them under the knife. And that's essentially what the book will be about. Now, whilst the book is still being written as we speak, the 4 curves have already been done and we've already made our measurements from them, and we're currently writing the book off those curves. Now, what we thought might be actually fun to do is to release these 4 curves in a box set, and so everybody could try these 4 curves even before they've read about their dissection within the book itself. So that's what this iteration set is actually about. It's about the 4 curves. Now, before we roast these 4 curves, we actually need to pick a coffee. So what coffee did we pick? And we picked the coffee from China, from the Yunnan district. And the reason why we chose this particular coffee was because we had a lot of people. China coffees have had a little bit of a resurgence, or I should say are becoming popular in the Melbourne coffee scene over the last few years, with a few roasters specifically putting them pretty heavily within their offerings. So as a result, we had a few of our customers come back to us and say, are you guys going to do one? So we thought, bugger it, we'll do one. So we rang Reeve from Singularity. He came down with a fistful of samples and we went through them all. Now, when we were cupping these coffees, we were looking for a specific coffee that we were going to put in our offering, which is, of course, this particular coffee. But we're also looking for a coffee that we could use for the box set. And for the box set, we need a coffee that was very, very specific. And whilst we were cupping this coffee on the table, we figured that it would actually meet those requirements. So what were those requirements for this particular box set? Okay, so this is some basics, and when I say basic, I mean very basic, some figures from the density press, the software from the density press. So when we're actually looking at green beans, we analyse the green beans and then we use those calculations in order to tell us how we're going to charge the drum, okay? So that's generally the first step. Now, when we put them in, we've probably get, I think there's another 15 or 20 different parameters, more so than these ones, but these are the ones I've cherry-picked because they're the most important ones and the ones that I use the most. So the first one is moisture. You'll get this from your green bean broker. In this case, it's just over 10%. And then you'll also get this figure, which is the bulk density figure. This figure, when we talk about density, is a lot of people think that what we're actually talking about is this particular figure here. That's not really true. We don't use this figure too much at all. We use it pretty heavily in charging of the drum and understanding what volume of coffee we're going to put in the drum, because we don't charge by mass, we charge by volume. So this figure has a lot of relevance in that. But aside from that, we don't use this figure too much. The second figure that we've got here is the green true density. This figure we use quite a lot. So this is actually the difference between these two. This is a bulk density, so it means it's a whole lot of beans put together and then measured their volume and their mass, and mass divided by volume equals density. So in this case, the bulk density in this case is 0.67, but if we were to take out all of those air spaces around the bean, then we would actually get this figure, which is the true density. Now, because it's greater than 1 and water has the density of 1, these beans would sink in water, which of course is the case with coffee beans. They sink in water. So that figure is a more important figure to us, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that one as we go along. This green bean fibre density figure is actually what happens when you take moisture out of this figure, because as we said, water has the density of 1. So in this case, this green true density figure has 10% of it is moisture. So 10% of this particular bean only has a density of 1. So when we take that out, the density goes up, and this tells us what our true fibre density is. This particular figure is really, really important towards the back end. So in the Maillard part of your roasting, this figure really comes into its own, and it's good to know. Don't worry so much about this volume at this point, but the only other figure I want to talk about briefly is the girth index figure. So this figure is, the way to think of it is how the beans actually all sit together in the drum when they're being roasted. So this figure is, the lower this figure is, the more this figure is like Tic Tacs. So if you have a look at Tic Tacs, they're sort of very, very long, and they sort of layer on top of one another. Because they layer on top, their air spaces are minimal. And because their air spaces are minimal, it means that the beans in the drum who are shaped in this regard or will actually get their energy from the conductive heat of other beans, as opposed to those that have more airflow, like a pea berry, for instance. A pea berry has a lot more airflow between it, and as a result, we'll get a lot more of its energy, not from conductive heat of the other beans, but more so from the air going through the bean pile, I should say. So this figure here, the higher this figure, it means there is essentially more air spaces in the bean pile, and the lower it is, the less air spaces. So a geisha might have a low bean girth and a pea berry might have a high one. So in this particular instance, we have this figure here together with the green fibre density, together with the bulk, tells us how we're going to charge our coffee and what volume we're going to put in the drum. Now we can use other different parameters as well that we can bring into these three, but that's essentially how we look at the green bean roasting. Now, once we so for us here, just to sort of recap, this figure here, the green density figure, if you were to look at a low density bean, 1.05 would be very, very low and probably have a lot of defects in it. If this bean you got a Kenya, you might get this figure up to 1.3. Okay. The green fibre figure might get up as high as 1.33, which is very, very high. So we chose this coffee because this figure is essentially in the middle of the range. And because it's in the middle of the range and it's got a big girth index, it means we're going to be able to manipulate this bean fairly well across our 4 different profiles. So that's why we chose it. The moisture content is also low. So because it's on the lower side, it means we're going to be able to turn this coffee very, very quick because some of the profiles we have a lot of heat in them. All right, so once we've got our green bean, we then roast our beans and then we get these results. So these results here are actually the results of the 4 profiles that you're actually going to be tasting. The top one is the decline, the next one is the pull-up, then there's an S-curve, and then there's a ramp curve. So when we have a look at these particular figures, most roasters tend to rely heavily upon this figure, which is the mass loss figure. We don't use this figure too much, which I'll get to in a moment, but the mass loss is how much weight and moisture was lost, or moisture and fibre, bean fibre, or organic loss, the bean actually went through. So this figure for us is not very finite. And so what we do is we split this figure down more and look at the components that make it up. So when you roast coffee, 2 things happen. The bean obviously expands, but it also loses mass. The mass it loses is both moisture and fibre, okay, or organic loss. So what we do is we then break this down into 2 more figures. And when we break them down into 2 more figures, which is the moisture itself, the moisture content of the coffee, and then also the organic loss of the coffee, we get to understand a hell of a lot more of what's going on, okay? So we're going to focus on this one a lot today. Over here we have the expansion, so you can see that all these coffees have expanded at different rates. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. And then here we have the roast density figure. They're all at different densities. For the sake of what we're talking about here now, the lower the density, the more soluble the coffee generally is, okay? The correction figure here we're not going to talk too much about. But this roast density figure, although we're actually not going to talk about it today, this is an extremely important figure, okay? Because this is the figure that your burr geometry is going to see, and it's also the figure that represents solubility of the coffee or capillary action of the coffee, what happens when water and coffee meet, okay? So it's a very, very important figure. We're not going to talk about it today, but this is the figure that which you would take forward into burr geometry and extraction. All right, so that's a basic rundown. We've got our green, which we just look at the figures in order to understand how we're going to load our drum and what heat transfer we're going to apply. And then once the bean comes out, we then actually apply the density press to it yet again, and we get more measurements of it and actually measure the roasted bean. This is not so common. People don't measure the roasted bean, and they're missing a lot of information when they don't do that. So the density press is all about measuring that bean, okay? So we're now going to quickly have a look at the actual curves which you're going to get in your box set. So there are 4 of these curves. They are the decline, the second curve is the pull-up, the third curve is a S-curve, and the fourth curve is a ramp curve. Now for those of you who haven't seen curves before and understand what they are, this particular curve is a very, very complicated curve. There's a lot of lines going on here, and generally you wouldn't see this many. You might only see 2 or 3 lines on a curve. We have a lot more because Little Red has, I think, at last count, about 15 different probes that he has on him, and that's because we're using Little Red to understand heat transfer with density. So he's very much a test rig. So he has a lot of information here, a lot of noise. You don't need to necessarily worry about that noise, but what we're going to do is take you through, for those people who are just home enthusiasts or brewers who have never seen a roast curve chart before, we're going to go through basically how they work. So we have here, this front phase is what's called the drying phase, and essentially it's you're putting the beans in green, and then you're raising the temperature, and they are coming up to where they start to change color. That is usually a distinct measurement that people make, and it's called color change. And that is where Maillard starts, which is this section here, the second section. And then the third section is what's called development. After first crack happens, then they measure what happens after first crack. So on a general curve, you'll see these 3. You'll see drying phase, Maillard phase, and what's called development. Now, we have those 3 marked out here on this, but what we have sort of come to adapt to is to see this in only 2 halves, okay? So we have the front here, which is what's called the drying phase. We call it the boil, but we're basically here manipulating moisture within the bean in order to control how the roast progresses. So if you think of what's happening on the inside of the bean and its inner momentum, that inner momentum is set up through this section here. So for us, it's quite possibly the most important section of the roast. A lot of people overlook it. This particular part here is linked to the expansion of the coffee, and it's linked to the moisture of the coffee, okay? The second half here is linked to organic loss. So organic loss starts at 160. So whilst most people measure development through this period here, we actually measure development from here to the back end, which means that whilst we mark first crack, we're only actually marking first crack as a point of reference. We don't care about how long this is, okay? Because we're measuring our development from here to here, okay? That's just something to notice. So for us, roasting is 2 halves. The front half, which is essentially moisture and expansion, and then we've got the back half, which is organic loss, okay, and development. All right, so that's our basic rundown that we have there of a curve. We're going to dive into these curves a little bit more, but before we do that, we have to actually address one other probe, okay? Now that probe is called the drum probe. Now we've been talking about the drum probe for a few years, and for those of you who want to follow us, actually, this is a good segue. Bush&Bush Coffee Systems, you can follow us, and this is where you'll get all of this information and what's happening with the density press and so forth. So all right, the first thing that we've got to talk about here is the bean probe. Now, the bean probe, you'll find on every roaster, and it's always going to be in the side where the bean pile is. So because it's on the left-hand side here, it means that the drum is actually spinning in a clockwise direction. So the bean pile, if we had a glass plate on this, would actually be about there, the bean pile, and it spins around here. The drum probe actually sits in this airspace outside of the bean pocket. Okay, now we call it the drum probe, and we think it's a very, very important probe. It was a probe that we put in as a suggestion by Jake, and we've put it into all of our roasters. This is our D-trick, which we do all of our singles and filter on. It's also in the Big Dog, the Joper, and it's also obviously on Little Red. Little Red has actually more than one of them, but our production roasters only have the one just in the front. So this is an important probe. You don't usually see it on roasters. You only see an inlet probe, which we also have, and then you see an exhaust probe. But for us, it's more important to have a probe right in the center near the bean so that we can see not only the energy or the heat coming off the bean, but we can see the heat going onto the bean. It allows us to make our heat transfer a lot more accurate, okay, because we're measuring it here rather than here and way up here. So that's the drum probe. Now, since we've been talking about drum probes, there's a lot of people have, I won't say a lot, but some people have been putting drum probes into their roasters in order to gain benefit from this probe. If you're thinking of doing that, you can hit in the comments below and just let us know and say, guys, I want a video on the drum probe. And if you do, where to put this drum probe, because there is some consideration that needs to be given to this probe. Don't just whack it in the faceplate anywhere. If that's the case, let us know, and next time Jake is down in the roastery, we'll get him to shoot a video on how he determines where to put this probe, okay? All right, so moving on. Back again to our roast curves. Okay, so our roast curves here are actually really quite busy, but we're going to separate them down because we don't need to see everything on this chart. Now, what we do need to take note of is this line here. So this blue line is actually the bean temperature. The drum probe that we just spoke about is this green line here. So this is the temperature of the air around the bean pile. And then the only other two probes that we're going to look at today is this one, which is the orange probe. This is actually a probe on the outside of the drum, okay? So it's in between the elements and the outside. So it's essentially measuring the temperature around the outside of the skin of the drum, okay? So Little Red has two different forms of heat transfer. He has conductive heat, so we can IR panels, which are underneath the roaster and heat the skin of the drum. And then he also has air, which goes through the drum. Those two heat sources are independent of each other. So we can turn one of them on or one of them off, no problem at all. So with Little Red, we have the two of them. So they are both part of his heat transfer. He can get heat from the skin of the drum or he can get heat coming through. So that makes up the four probes we're looking at. The bean probe here, we've got the drum probe, we've got the heat on the outside of the skin of the drum, and then we've got the heat coming through the bean pile or through the drum itself. There's two RORs here. This blue one is obviously off the blue line, which is the bean ROR, and then we also have the green line, which is the drum ROR. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about RORs later. Okay, so let's step through our four different probes. So this is a decline, different profiles rather. So the first one was a decline, the second one is a pull-up curve, the third one is an S curve, and then the fourth one is a ramp curve. Now, when we did this series, what we're going to focus on, as we said, is just this back end, which is the development phase. So in order to understand development, we have to understand a few different things. First of all, how much temperature did we go up? So we started at 142 at color and then we dropped at 175, okay? The temperature is these two together. So we actually went 32 degrees, okay? 33 degrees. So we went 33 degrees in a period of the time, which is 3:15 and 3:38. What's that? 3:50. Okay, so 3 minutes 50, we went 33 degrees. Okay, so that is essentially one part of our development. How high did we go in temperature over what time frame? That's our first development. The second part of the development is what was happening with the heat when that happened. Okay, now our ROR is pushing down. In this case, so is our heat. Our heat is declining, okay? So right from the start, we made our momentum, and this is what happens with declines. You come in, you activate the moisture in the center of the bean, which causes the momentum of the inner bean to actually start to increase. And then what happens is once that inner momentum starts to travel, we then take the heat away slowly. Okay, that's what's called a decline, because it's a declining heat transfer with a declining ROR. Also, as you'll see, what's happening is the heat is declining around the drum pile. So they're all actually working together. Now, just because we see here that the temperature is declining around the energy within the drum, doesn't mean that's always the case, okay? Now, this highlights why we don't use the ROR. The ROR on the bean is the last thing that you can see, okay? You're going to see it more obvious in the next curves, but basically this bean ROR is the last point of reference because it's the last thing that has happened that you're measuring, which is actually the bean. However, if we focus on this and we just try to see the ROR, we are actually roasting to the last point of heat transfer. What's more important is that we look at the heat transfer, which is actually making up that temperature rise, not the temperature rise itself, but the heat that is actually being applied to it and the heat around the bean pile itself. This is where the heat transfer happens. It does not happen in the ROR itself, okay? This will hopefully become more evident as we go along. So in this particular instance, though, we are looking, as we said, just at development. So because we know that the organic loss happens in this back area, we can say how long did it take to get there, how high did we go, and how much organic loss did we lose, and was the heat declining? If we put all of these factors together, that is what makes up our development, okay? That is what we're tasting in the cup. So in this instance, our first curve is a decline. It's called a decline because all of our energy and all of our momentum is declining, which means that our development is long, low, and slow, okay? No problem. Second curve. Second curve is what's called a pull-up curve, okay? I don't know if this actually has a real name or not. I just call them a pull-up. So in this particular instance, a pull-up curve, as you can see, just has one heat transfer all the way through. So you can't necessarily see it here, but there is only one setting that I hit. As soon as I charge this coffee, I hit that gas setting, and that gas setting, I think from memory, is 49 burner and 51 airflow. And I just leave that heat setting for the entire way, and I don't change it at all. Nothing changes. So I can go away, make myself a coffee, come back, and then just turn it off when it actually hits its temperature. Now, to understand what's happening in this instance and the philosophy behind this curve, it's much easier to deviate for a second and talk about baking a cake because it's an easier concept to understand. And then we'll bring that analogy back and apply it to this. So when you have a cake, you've set your oven at, let's just say 180 degrees. I'm not a baker, so I don't know, but let's just say you've set it at 180. Now, when you set your oven at 180 degrees and you put the cake in, the cake is then going to cook over a certain amount of time, which has already been predetermined by that 180 degrees. So it means the cake is going to come up in temperature, and it is going to come up in temperature over a certain amount of time. That arc that it comes up to has fully been determined by this temperature, which is the temperature of the oven. In the case of our example, 180 degrees. So if we then come back and use that same philosophy to roasting, what that means is we have set our oven, in this case, 340 degrees, and we just leave it at 340 degrees. We charge the coffee, and then it just slowly comes up to temperature. Now, the ROR will still decrease, but as you can see, it's not decreasing in its heat. This is why the ROR is not a good indicator of watching what's happening with heat transfer, because we still have a declining ROR, but in this case, we actually have the same amount of heat being transferred the entire time. So now also what's happening is the drum probe ROR is also declining, and that is essentially because as it's come in, it's taken off really, really quickly, and then it's slowly started to roll in. If we wanted to increase and make this a faster profile, let's just say we want to bring it out in 7 minutes. It's very, very simple. Instead of charging at 340 degrees, we would charge it, let's just say 400. If we charge at 400, then this is going to turn much more aggressive and it's going to pull up, and we will drop it at our temperature, 174, quicker. And that means that the whole curve will be shorter and the development itself will be shorter. So the way to think of a pull-up curve is you have the volume of beans you're putting in, you have the end temperature that you want to get to in the time frame that you want to get to, and then you just set this in order to do it. And we pull the temperature up to the temperature we want. If we want it to be a longer roast and go all the way up to 10 minutes, then we don't charge at 340 inlet heat. We charge at, let's say, 300. We charge at 300. This is going to go slower and it goes all the way out. Okay? But that's all it is. It's simply just setting your oven, putting your beans in, and then pulling them out. Now, on our bigger roasters, we can't just leave this all the way across. Okay? We can only do that on Little Red because he's a freak. But on our bigger production roasters, we would have to start dropping this heat off very aggressively towards the back here. Okay? Now, what does that mean for our development? Well, we've still got a declining ROR, and as you can see here, we've turned off the skin temp. In this case, we turn off the skin temp at about 250 degrees, and then it starts to roll in. And the reason why we're trying to do that is because we're trying to match the skin temp at drop with the same as the air temp going through the drum. Okay, so we're trying to line all of these up. So in this case, we start off with a little bit of heat just to help it get up the hill a little bit, and then we just turn it off and just let it roll in. Now, as far as development is concerned, because we still have this high at the back end, we're declining on our RORs. So essentially, the bean is telling you that it is declining, but the heat is actually staying maintained. In this instance, then, it means your development on the back end is going to have more heat than what it does on the decline because it's declining in its heat. Okay? So this instance means that our development time here, or our organic loss, has actually happened, even though it has happened over the same, essentially almost the same time, the same temperature. It's not going to be the same. Even though the ROR suggests it's the same, it's not, because we have kept our heat stable throughout the whole thing. As a general rule, this is a profile that we use a lot on our production roasters, together with the decline, depending upon the development of the coffee. If we have a coffee that wants to be a long, low, slow development, then we do a decline. If we want a more zingier coffee, then we will always do a pull-up, because on the pull-up, you have a lot more heat over a shorter period and a much more condensed. So what that means then is that the coffee generally comes out brighter and sweeter, rather than letting it roll in for a longer period of time under a lower heat. So pull-ups generally are more brighter and more sweeter than what a decline will be, okay, even though both their RORs are going down. All right, so that is our pull-up curve. Now let's just go to our third one. This is where things start to get a little bit loose. All right, so this is called an S-curve. Now S-curves are an old school way of roasting. It was done, I haven't seen anyone pull these curves for over 15 years. And they were very much an old style of roasting, and they're called S-curves because this looks like an S, okay? Now, because that looks like an S, it also tells us what our heat transfer is doing. The best way to think of a S-curve is it's a pull-up front, okay? So this is just a pull-up, just like we had before, except it was way up here, obviously. So there's less heat, but it is still pulling up. And then once we get to our 100 degrees, we ramp. So in this case, the bean temp, as we can see here, is about 125 degrees, which means our boil inside the bean is now activated, and then we start to ramp. This is also another good indication of why I will always use a drum probe over the bean probe. So the bean probe here is just slowly starting to go up, which makes sense, but have a look at the drum probe. It's already coming down. It's telling me already that I'm losing momentum. And then here, I spank it. You can see here is where I've given it the energy, and it goes straight up, straight away. So the drum probe is showing the heat transfer before the bean has actually registered it. You can see it starts registering it about here, and then it's starting to go up. So it's lagging indicator. So again, the ROR of your bean line is a lagging indicator, okay? Not to mention the mathematical algorithms which are put on these probes anyway, which do it over a certain time frame. So this really is the last indicator in the drum, all right? Okay, so anyway, what's happened here is we've come in, we've done a pull-up, and then we start to ramp. And you can see that here. This is me just increasing the gas settings. Obviously, Little Red is not a gas, he's an electric roaster, but for want of a better term, we're increasing our gas settings going up. So what then happens is he comes down and then comes back up, and you'll see that the ROR is a V shape, and then the temperature increases as well. Inside the bean pile, it starts to go up, inside the drum. And it's doing that because the outside temp doesn't change too much, okay, on the outside skin of the drum, but the inlet is going high, okay? So this is called an S curve. Now, what you'll notice is that the time, again, for our organic loss, which starts at color and finishes here when we dump, is shorter, but it is also higher. It's 37 degrees, whereas the others, I think, was 30 from memory, wasn't it? Yeah, that's 32, and the first one was 33. So in this third example, in the S curve, we've actually got 38. Okay, so we've increased more, so we've gone a higher in temp, and we've done it over a shorter time frame. And not only that, but we're increasing our heat at the back end. So in our first one, the decline, we were decreasing. In our pull-up, we were holding firm, and now we've changed and we've started to increase the heat towards the back. So that's our S curve. So if we had an S curve and we pulled off the front, we got rid of the pull-up and we just started our heat not here at 30, but all the way down here at 0, we would have our fourth curve, which is a ramp curve. So the ramp starts with no heat at all. You can see it's on 0. It's basically just drop the beans in. They've turned at 48 degrees, which is not very hot at all, and then we slowly start stepping up. So in this case, you can see the inlet has gone high. It's stepped all the way up and goes over, and then the bean is always increasing. So it's an increased bean ROR, which makes sense because obviously we've started so low and we're just increasing heat. And you can see that the drum ROR goes up as well. So we've got the heat around the drum increases as well, and we've got this heat. So we're actually pulling 450 degrees when we drop, okay, which is really, really high. So this particular curve, if we have a look at it, our Maillard starts very, very late. It starts at 7.5 minutes. So our Maillard is actually our whole development is only 1.5 minutes long. It's very, very short, but it also goes up 30 degrees, which is the same as our decline. So it's done it in a much faster time frame, and we're still increasing heat when we do it. So it's a very, very different way to cook. Okay, so we've got to start seeing development not only as how much distance do we cover over what time frame, but what is actually the heat transfer that's happening. When you start mixing all of these around, things start to change in the drum. Now, these are things that can't always be seen just by looking at the ROR or measuring your development after first crack. There's clearly a lot more complicated things that are going on here. Now, there's two other things that we've added to this curve, which are not actually shown on here, but they actually are, but I'm not going to show you where they are because it's not relevant. I'll just tell you. In this particular instance, we doubled the airflow. So in the first two graphs, these two graphs here, the airflow was 1.2 meters per second, okay? In this last graph, it's 2.4 meters per second. So we have doubled the air velocity going through the drum. What that means is that this heat will actually come through and penetrate the bean even more, okay? So whenever we increase our flow going through the drum, we get a higher organic loss as well. Now, the last thing that we actually did is we changed our skin speed. So the skin speed here is actually going higher as well. And then the skin speed in this case, so we don't measure RPM because RPM has no reference at all unless it has a circumference attached to it. So RPM is irrelevant to us. But what we do is we measure on all of our drums, which you saw here, in the Dietrich, you would have seen up in the back corner here, it said 88 centimeters per second. That's the skin speed of the Dietrich. In this case, these first two curves are actually 65 centimeters per second, and the last curve here is 75 centimeters per second. So we've spun the drum faster. When you spin the drum faster, you get more organic loss because you've taken your bean pile away from being a conductive bean pile. Remember, we spoke about that earlier, to making it a bean pile that has more air going through it. So you'll get more organic loss. So in this case, because the development is so short, the time is so short, I've thrown everything, including the kitchen sink, at it. I've given it full heat, okay? We're at 100% here with its heat. So I've dropped it with 100% heat. We've got this one here is actually up as well. So the temperature of the skin of the drum is actually really, really hot, so it doesn't bleed any of the heat away from the bean pile. And then also we've spun the drum faster and we've used double airflow. So this is maximum heat. So how does this taste? It's obviously going to be different, but if you just look at the 30 seconds, like a lot of people will measure, then this bean is clearly not going to taste the same as what the first one is, even though they're both at 30, well, even the second one, they're both at 30 seconds. They are not going to taste the same. Okay, so that's our development. Try and think of development as not only the heat going into the bean pile, but also how high did it go over what time frame, and that represents our development. Now, having thought about that and you've got those concepts in your head, let's go back here and quickly have a look at all of our figures. You'll see on the left here, we've got the roast girth of our coffee, and the roast girths have changed. You'll see on the decline, the girth rate is 0.79 on the roast, and then on the pull-up, the S-curve and the ramps, they're all higher. That's because they've all got more heat towards the back. If they have more heat towards the back, then it means the crack will actually be more powerful. If the crack is more powerful, it means that the seam is going to open up more, which means our girth rate is going to be greater than the green girth rate that we spoke about earlier. You can also see here that the expansion on the right-hand side is different. So the decline has the lowest expansion, or one of the lowest expansions, I should say, and obviously the ramp has the highest expansion. Okay, it has the highest expansion because there is so much more heat and it's using moisture in a different way. Funnily enough, though, it also has the highest moisture content, even though it has the biggest expansion. So there is a lot going on here. Once you start measuring the coffee and see it in context to its organic loss, and you see it in context to its heat transfer and all of these different figures, you can start to get a better understanding of what's really happening in the drum. So have a think about that when you're cupping the coffees, okay? When you're cupping all of these curves, think about their development, okay? That's what this exercise is about. Now, you might have a favorite that you like here. That's cool. But when you're looking at it, cup the decline. Compare the decline with the ramp. What sort of development and how is that tasted? So does the ramp taste really short? It might be really bright because the development phase is really short with a lot of heat. So maybe it's really short on the back end as well. The decline might actually be smoother. It might have a lot more body because its development is over a longer, lower, slower time. How does that actually taste? So when we're looking at these different coffees, try to actually compare them. It's not really the purpose to come in and just go, you know what, I don't like the ramp, do a mic drop and walk out the room, okay? Whilst that's very bold, it doesn't actually learn anything from this. Now, you might have this ramp and you might go, you know what, I don't like the ramp. We've given this ramp to somebody, they actually love the ramp and they think it's the best part of the best curve in the series. However, what it does do is it highlights more of the varietal, and perhaps the varietal, being a Catamore, is not something you want to roast light, but we're just using this as a set. It's not meant to be showing the best iteration of all of these beans. When we roasted these coffees, we picked the bean which would go across all four curves, okay? And we had to pick something which would sit in the middle and just be able to be bent in all four ways. The reality is that some beans just simply don't like ramp curves and others would love a ramp curve. But most of our drums out there can't do ramp curves. Only Little Red can because he's got so much power. So when you're looking at these things, try to look at these different profiles, see how you go with the profile, try to then correlate the heat transfer to your palate. If you can do that, you're going to become a lot better cupper and a lot better roaster. Now, the last thing that I actually have to talk about is colour, because I know we're going to get asked it in the comments, so I might as well just talk about it now. We don't talk about colour. We don't use colour because colour, if now that we've gone through this whole talk, hopefully you can start to see that all of the different ways in order to make heat transfer come through coffee is more important than trying to express all of that as a color. Because if you just have two colors the same, and I should say that two of these graphs, when we were doing initial checks, these two, the first two here, the decline and the pull-up, they actually had exactly the same color, and these two actually had the same color as well. Now, I could easily roast these four coffees and have them all exactly the same color. But my point is, why would I do that? I'm trying to then roast a coffee for the sake of a color. And because color has matched to flavor, well, I don't believe color does match flavor. And the reason why is because flavor is created by A, the farmer, and then B, how I apply a heat to that bean. That's how flavor is created. It's not created through a color. I don't believe that you can use color in order to judge flavor, and predominantly because color itself does not have a taste. It's just brown. And not only that, but we represent that color in a number. So we're using a number in order to translate a color to flavor. So what I think that's actually being used with people who use color, I don't know because I've never been able to get a straight answer, but from what I think is actually happening is they are using color in order to use color to explain development, okay? Now, in this case, I would rather use all of these different graphs and all of these different measurements that we have down here in order to understand heat transfer, okay, which is development. But trying to put all of this back into one color, I just don't see the benefit in doing that, okay? And that's why we don't use color. Now, you can use color. You can use the press and you can use color as well. There's no problem. But I think sooner or later, you're going to get to the point where you'll be able to see how much you can manipulate beans, and you're going to see that color actually doesn't correlate anymore. At least that's our experience. All right, so that brings us to the end. I hope you enjoy these. As I said, try and see them as an educational series. They're not meant to be, isn't this an awesome coffee? Okay, we do that in other areas, but this is an educational pack. So I hope you enjoy the coffees. I hope you pick some differences in the roast curves, and we'll see you on the other side. Thanks for watching. Cheers, guys.